In order to look at the rhythmic content of recent New Zealand composition, I've chosen 3 works that exhibit distinct approaches to musical time. They're not representative. I'm not trying to concoct a taxonomy of rhythmic types from New Zealand music. Instead, I'm going to try and sink my teeth into these works, regarding them with both magnifying glass and telescope, and seeing what illuminates itself. And the works that I'm looking at today are by John Passathis, Chris Watson, and Jerome Speck. But first, I must begin with a few disclaimers. Firstly, the term recent is a little loose here. These 3 pieces are all from the 90s and early 2000s, which in the context of composing now is not particularly up to the minute. I believe, however, that there are some contemporary topoi or topics worth discussing within this repertoire, and that alone qualifies their inclusion. Secondly, the analytical methods I'm using here are drawn directly from my doctoral dissertation, which was called New Musical Rhythm, in which I examined rhythmic activity in works by Stravinsky, Varese, Ludoslawski, Elliott Carter, and Brian Fernyhough. And as far as my dissertation was intended as a theory of rhythm, it was by no means a theory of metre. There exist plenty of these by Maury, Yeston, Cooper and Meyer, Gendall and Jackendoff, and others from which I departed. By examining rhythm outside of metre, and I define metre as a repetitive and consistent emphasis on a pattern of impulses, by examining rhythm outside of this, the interaction of durations and tempi can define what I analyse with more autonomy, unfettered by a need to address the bar line. And I consider this approach much more sensitive to contemporary rhythm. But I do address aspects of duration, emphasis, and particularly tempo in my methods. And I present my analyses as much as possible in clear music notation. And lastly, I should mention 2 distinctions of rhythmic types, or types of rhythmic motion, that I've borrowed from Kyle Gann in his book on Mancaro. They are arithmetic and geometric development, where arithmetic indicates durational interplay by the addition or subtraction of a consistent pulse unit, which is useful for things like additive rhythms. And where geometric indicates rhythms that have the effect of fluctuating or modulating the tempo. And before I go on to the first example, I should comment a little on my analytical decisions in decision making. Try as we might, music theory can never really be a watertight science. I see analysis as a form of interpretation, and I've used other parameters like pitch content, harmony, melody and contour, dynamics, articulation, timbre and texture to inform my analytical decisions. Time will not allow for a full defence of every decision I've made, but please trust that I've made every effort to be rigorous and consistent. So this is the first phrase from John Passathis' piece Maîtrise Dance for percussion and piano, and my analytical staff is up the top. As you can see, I've isolated rhythm from other parameters. I've grouped subdivisions into single durations and durations into small groups. I've also used marcato indications to orientate emphasis within each group, and for clarity I've used numerical notation to show the arithmetic process in semiquaver units. At times I've grouped impulses, and at other times they stand alone, like those semiquavers in the 3rd group of the analysis that cross the first bar line in the score. This is because the marcato indication on the percussion downbeat of the 2nd bar indicates to me that it should receive some emphasis, even though a parallel or similar figure would incorporate that impulse into a single analytical duration. In this case, and in all cases, I take my cue from the score rather than any theoretical imposition. And even though the first two groups use only dotted quavers, the almost immediate arithmetic rhythmic change in the third group makes any perceived meter entirely elusive. One could conceive of small patterns or building blocks like Boulez did with the Rite of Spring in his essay collection, Notes on an Apprenticeship, but I see this technique as an amplification of the pulse unit, which in this case is the semiquaver. The semiquaver underpins rhythm here not only in its presence, but also by assuming the additive value, the unit being added to or subtracted from successive durations. The semiquaver drives the matrice dance mechanism, building upwards into an arithmetic durational interplay. The next example is from Chris Watson's piece, Derailleur or Derailleurs, depending on which bicycle shop you go to. I'm sure the composer won't break the fourth wall and correct me. And this is for flute, guitar, cello, percussion and piano. So in order to analyse Chris Watson's work, I've used tempo changes extensively. The tempo in the score for this passage is crotchet equals 80. So you can see that I've reimagined the triplets as crotchet equals 120. The quintuplets on this page, as crotchet equals 100 and 150 for the triplet embedded within the quintuplet. And rests above a duration indicate the displacement of a tempo change after an attack point. This notation also plays into Watson's clever use of metric modulation. When the tempo changes in the last bar of this excerpt, it's been prepared in the bar preceding. The quintuplet acts as a kind of rhythmic pivot. And yes, dotted crotchets at 66 are the same as crotchets at 100. So why do I do this with these tempo changes? One reason is presentation. I can maintain grouping and durational structure no matter what kind of subdivisions they traverse. And another reason is for analytical flexibility. By using tempo as an analytical tool, I can clarify durational interplay no matter how complex the written rhythms appear. This is informed by what I call arithmetic geometric equivalence, as demonstrated by this example, which presents two expressions of the same rhythm. So looking at the analysis of this passage, I think we see a genuine rhythmic evolution that moves from extended hemiola type rhythms with shifting pulse units to asymmetrical groups and durations, which still utilise geometric written out tempo fluctuations. This passage from Jerome Speak's Arabesques requires a contrapuntal analysis. Even though the violin part in this excerpt is more prominent, I believe the piano carries much of the rhythmic momentum. So the upper staff is an analysis of the violin part, and the lower staff is an analysis of the piano part. And like in the Watson example, these analyses use frequent and independent tempo changes. What strikes me about Jerome Speak's approach is the diversity and sometimes polarity of rhythmic values he deploys in close proximity. Even with these violin refrains, these sort of small little gestures that are followed by a long tremolo, he still manages to juxtapose the very short with the very long duration-wise and superimpose this structure over a continuous yet turbulent piano part. And if you know this work, there are some striking moments that take diversity and polarity to another level, particularly a lovely revelation in the middle of the piece where the violin sustains something very soft and very static for over 20 seconds right before launching into something much more frenetic. This polarity, however, affects some of my analytical tempo changes. So some of these result from tuplets in the score, 7 in the time 6, 3 in the time 2, for instance. And some of them are a little different. The second semiquaver in this group contained 5 hemi-demi-semiquavers, or 5 64th notes in the score. So in order to make it look like a semiquaver, I've shortened the value ever so slightly and modulated the tempo by a ratio of 4 to 5. This does simplify the visual impact of the rhythm, effectively rounding down and avoiding ties. But is this decision purely cosmetic? This quote from Stockhausen argues for an awareness of temporal phenomena around polarity. I'll just read it very quickly. If a first phase lasts 1 second and the second phase 2 seconds, there is a difference of 1 second. 2 phases of 11 seconds and 12 seconds duration have the same difference of 1 second. But we perceive the difference between 1 and 2 seconds as relatively large, whereas the same difference between 11 and 12 seconds is hardly perceptible. This means that we do not perceive differences, but rather proportions. 1 to 2 is the larger proportion compared with 11 to 12. If Stockhausen's right, and I think he is, the longer durations become, the more flexible any analysis should be to represent them. And since I'm now going to move from what I call the foreground to the middle ground, or from analyses of rhythm to analyses of phrase lengths, it proves handy to consider time in terms of proportion and ratio. This middle ground analysis of the first 2 phrases in the psathis include an impulse for each foreground group, with values halved, hence the much slower tempi. And thanks to some temporal nuance with analytical tempo changes, we can see a little arithmetic development, which one might expect from this passage, matching what the foreground analysis showed up. Although, as you can see in the second group, it occasionally appears a little square and a little regular. Here's the same passage with those values quartered and each phrase allocated a duration. The same process for the Watson reveals a relatively balanced phrase structure with an almost symmetrical trio of phrase lengths in the first group, underpinning the comparative turbulence of the rhythmic surface. But in the speak, we once again see diversity. In a collection of 5 phrase lengths between 1 and 4 units long, each duration length is accounted for. And now, taking this analytical method further, I'll look at what I call the background, or the analysis of formal pacing. In this reduction of the whole of the psathis, all of Maitra's dance, values are 64thed, and a reasonably regular series of sections unfold. The second duration here, the second section, is the only one with a kind of arithmetic change. And if you know the piece, you might remember that the form is characterised by a charge towards a climax at the end, interrupted and restarted a few times. In this case, though, these sections feel quite even, or they feel like they're sort of half or double the length of a previous one. The Watson has a beautiful formal asymmetry, which results in part from the tempo changes, in this case metric modulations, within each section, especially the last, which is driven by a systematic accelerando. And in the background analysis of the speak, we see that he re-establishes his use of diverse and polarised durations with wildly irregular consecutive sections. For me, this seems a comprehensive approach to musical time, where every structural level is conceived and delivered with equal imagination, generating an ever-present spontaneity. And no matter what kind of approach each composer takes to rhythm and macro rhythm, I believe it's important to cultivate an awareness of the impact that different types of writing has on the flow of musical time. In Jerome Speak's musical language, or his rhythmic language, there's a sleekness in the way that isomorphic levels interact. Durations, phrases, formal lengths, all behave with the same sense of diverse proportion. The outermost levels of Chris Watson's approach were likewise harmonious, utilising tempo changes that matched his polyrhythmic writing on a local level. And with the Psathis, where additive and syncopated rhythms were underpinned with comparatively square formal proportions, it became clear that his formal concerns were aimed at making the piece feel right. And while that's absolutely valid, I believe that music that seeks to extend or subvert this feeling of rightness exerts a greater impact on the listener. So many composers throughout history have worked to make things feel right that don't or shouldn't feel right, to modulate our sense of comfort, balance and proportion. My discussion and methods provide only an introduction to these phenomena, but I hope the discussion to this end continues. Thank you, and roll credits.